The moment didn't begin when the microphones turned on, it began long before that, in the silence that filled the room as people waited for something they couldn't quite define. There was an unusual stillness in the air, the kind that doesn't come from calm, but from anticipation. Cameras were already positioned, reporters were whispering to each other in low voices, and security stood closer than they normally would for an event like this. It didn't feel like preparation for a press conference. It felt like preparation for damage control. Because everyone in that room understood one thing, even if they didn't say it out loud, this wasn't just another promotional stop. This was Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao finally sharing space after years of avoidance, tension, and unresolved conflict. And when that kind of history sits in one room, it doesn't stay quiet for long. It builds, slowly and quietly, until something triggers it. And on that night, everyone was waiting for that trigger, even if they didn't know exactly what it would be. To understand why this moment felt so heavy, you have to go back not just months, but years, to when the idea of this fight first started gaining attention. At the time, both men were at the peak of their careers, dominating opponents in completely different ways. Mayweather was precise, defensive, almost untouchable. Pacquiao was explosive, relentless, unpredictable. Fans didn't just want to see them fight, they needed to see it. It became the kind of matchup that defined an era, the kind that people would talk about for decades. But instead of happening when it should have, it kept falling apart. Negotiations collapsed. Blame was passed back and forth. Public statements contradicted private discussions. And over time, what should have been excitement slowly turned into frustration. Not just for fans, but for the fighters themselves. Because every delay added pressure. Every failed deal added tension. And every year that passed made the eventual meeting feel less like a sporting event, and more like unfinished business that had been waiting too long to be resolved. Floyd Mayweather walked into that room like a man who had never lost control of a situation in his life. His body language was relaxed, but it wasn't natural, it was intentional. Every step, every glance, every small movement was part of a system he had perfected over years in the spotlight. He understood something most fighters didn't, that battles don't start in the ring, they start in moments like this. Press conferences, interviews, public appearances. These were opportunities, not obligations. Opportunities to gain psychological advantage before the fight even begins. And Mayweather had built an entire career on that principle. He didn't just want to win physically. He wanted to break his opponents mentally before they ever had a chance to test him. And as he sat down, adjusting slightly in his chair, scanning the room without appearing to focus on anything, it was clear that he was already working. Already calculating. Already looking for the smallest opening that he could turn into control. Manny Pacquiao entered differently, but that difference was exactly what made him dangerous. Where Mayweather's presence filled the room with calculated energy, Pacquiao's presence changed the atmosphere in a quieter way. He greeted people, smiled briefly, acknowledged the crowd, small gestures that seemed simple but carried meaning. He wasn't trying to dominate the room. He wasn't trying to control the narrative. And that lack of effort created a kind of unpredictability that Mayweather couldn't easily manipulate. Because you can't easily get inside the head of someone who doesn't react the way you expect them to. Pacquiao's calmness wasn't passive, it was disciplined. It came from years of experience, from understanding pressure at the highest level, and from knowing that not every battle needs to be fought with noise. But beneath that calm surface was something stronger. A focus that didn't shift, a confidence that didn't need validation, and a quiet awareness that this moment mattered more than most people in that room fully understood. As the press conference officially began, everything appeared normal on the surface. Questions were asked, answers were given, and both fighters played their roles with professional precision. Topics like training camps, preparation, and expectations filled the early part of the conversation. It was controlled, predictable, almost routine. But that surface-level normality was misleading. Because underneath it, something else was happening. The pauses between answers were slightly longer than usual. Eye contact lasted just a little too long. The tone of certain responses carried an edge that wasn't obvious unless you were paying close attention. It was the kind of tension that doesn't announce itself loudly, but instead builds quietly, layer by layer, until it reaches a point where it can't stay contained anymore. And the people in that room, the experienced journalists, the analysts, the cameras, they could feel it. They knew that what they were watching wasn't just a standard exchange. It was the beginning of something that could change at any moment. The shift didn't happen loudly, it happened subtly, almost invisibly, in a way that only those paying close attention could truly recognize in real time. It began with a comment from Mayweather that, on the surface, didn't seem explosive. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't filled with obvious aggression, but it carried something far more dangerous: intention. He referenced Pacquiao's past, hinting at controversies that had followed him for years, the kind of topics that had always existed in the background but were rarely brought directly into moments like this. And that was the key difference. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't casual. It was calculated. The kind of statement designed not just to be heard, but to provoke, to test, to see what kind of reaction it would pull from a man known for his composure. And as soon as those words left his mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. The reaction from the room was immediate, even if it wasn't loud. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Reporters who had been casually preparing their next questions suddenly leaned forward, their attention fully locked onto the stage. Camera operators adjusted their angles, zooming in slightly, instinctively recognizing that something important had just happened. This is what experienced media professionals are trained to detect: not just noise, but shifts in energy. And this was a clear shift. Because everyone understood that certain lines, once crossed, changed the nature of the interaction completely. What had been a controlled, professional exchange just seconds earlier was now something else entirely. Something unpredictable. Something real. And in moments like that, the risk isn't just escalation, it's losing control altogether. Pacquiao didn't respond immediately, and that silence was more powerful than any quick reaction could have been. He sat there for a brief moment, his expression tightening just enough to show that he had registered exactly what was said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. But it was visible. And in that moment, the calm version of Pacquiao that the world was used to seeing shifted slightly into something more focused, more serious. When he finally spoke, his voice remained steady, controlled, and deliberate. He didn't raise it. He didn't match the tone that had just been directed at him. Instead, he responded in a way that felt almost calculated in its restraint. He spoke about respect, about discipline, about letting performance speak louder than words. But beneath that calm delivery was something undeniable, a message that he wasn't ignoring what had just happened, and he certainly wasn't backing down from it. For a brief moment, it seemed like that response might stabilize the situation. The calmness, the control, the refusal to escalate, it created a window where things could have returned to normal. But that window didn't last long. Because for someone like Mayweather, calm resistance can sometimes be more provoking than open aggression. It doesn't give him something to directly push against, something to overpower in the moment. Instead, it forces him to push harder, to dig deeper, to try and break that composure in a different way. And that's exactly what began to happen. His posture shifted slightly forward, his tone sharpened, and the rhythm of his speech changed. He was no longer just answering questions. He was engaging directly, personally, and with increasing intensity. The transformation wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. The version of Mayweather that had walked into the room calm, composed, controlled, began to give way to something more raw. His words came faster now, less measured, carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. This wasn't part of the usual promotional performance. This felt different. More emotional. More direct. And the more he spoke, the more it became clear that this moment had moved beyond strategy. Because while Mayweather was known for his control, he was also known for something else: his ability to turn moments into statements. And in this moment, he wasn't just speaking to Pacquiao. He was speaking to everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone waiting to see who would take control of this narrative. Then it happened, the moment that would define everything that followed. "I'll make you pay," the words landed with a weight that didn't need volume to be felt. They weren't shouted, but they cut through the air with precision, stopping everything else in its tracks. For a fraction of a second, the room went completely still. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from calm, but from shock, the kind where people instinctively pause because they recognize that something important has just been said. And in that moment, it became clear that this press conference had crossed a line. It was no longer just promotion. It was no longer controlled. It had become personal in a way that couldn't be undone. The reaction that followed was immediate and chaotic. Reporters began speaking over each other, trying to capture the moment while it was still unfolding. Questions were thrown out rapidly, not all of them coherent, but all driven by the same urgency to document what was happening before it escalated further. Cameras zoomed in aggressively, focusing on faces, expressions, reactions. Every small movement suddenly mattered. Every glance carried meaning. This is what moments like this do. They turn ordinary details into critical ones. And for the people in that room, it was clear that they were no longer just covering a press conference. They were witnessing something that had the potential to spiral beyond expectations. Pacquiao's response to that moment was one of the most telling aspects of the entire event. He didn't react with anger. He didn't interrupt. He didn't attempt to match the intensity that had just been directed at him. Instead, he held his position, his expression now fully serious, his focus locked entirely on Mayweather. When he spoke, his voice remained steady, but there was a firmness to it that hadn't been as pronounced before. He made it clear, without raising his tone, that whatever needed to be said would ultimately be answered in the ring. It was a controlled response, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from certainty rather than emotion. And in that moment, it created a powerful contrast that everyone in the room could feel. That contrast quickly became the defining narrative of the entire encounter. On one side was Mayweather, aggressive, vocal, pushing the moment forward with intensity. On the other side was Pacquiao, calm, composed, refusing to be pulled into that same emotional space. It wasn't just a difference in personality. It was a difference in approach, in mindset, in how each man chose to fight before the fight itself. And for observers, analysts, and fans, this contrast became something to analyze, debate, and interpret. Because in boxing, mental dynamics often matter just as much as physical ones. And what was playing out in front of them wasn't just tension, it was strategy, emotion, and psychology all colliding in real time. Behind the scenes, the situation was even more intense than what was visible on camera. Security had already been positioned closer than usual before the event began, a precaution that now seemed fully justified. There were quiet movements along the edges of the room, subtle adjustments in positioning, small signals being exchanged between staff members who were trained to respond if things escalated further. This wasn't panic, it was preparation. Because events like this, when they shift unexpectedly, can move very quickly from controlled to chaotic. And while nothing physical had happened, the energy in the room suggested that it wasn't entirely out of the question. That possibility, even if small, changed how everyone reacted. There were also unspoken layers to this moment that most viewers would never fully see. Years of negotiations, disagreements, public statements, and private frustrations had all led to this point. These weren't just two fighters promoting a match. These were two individuals carrying the weight of everything that had happened leading up to it. Every delay, every accusation, every missed opportunity. It all existed beneath the surface of this interaction. And moments like the one that had just occurred don't come from nowhere. They come from accumulation. From pressure that builds over time until it finds a way to release itself. And in that press conference, that release had finally begun. As the event continued, there was an attempt to regain control, to steer the conversation back towards safer territory. Moderators asked more structured questions, trying to shift focus back to the fight itself, to training, to preparation. And for a while, it seemed to work. The tone stabilized slightly, the intensity lowered just enough to allow the event to move forward. But something had already changed. The underlying tension didn't disappear. It remained, just beneath the surface, influencing every response, every glance, every pause. Because once a moment like that happens, it doesn't simply fade. It lingers. It reshapes the rest of the interaction. When the press conference finally began to come to an end, there was a sense of unfinished energy in the room. Not chaos, not escalation, but something unresolved. Both fighters stood, their movements controlled, their expressions neutral enough to avoid further conflict. But there was no handshake. No gesture of mutual acknowledgement. And that absence spoke louder than any words that could have been exchanged in that moment. Because in environments like this, small actions carry significant meaning. And the lack of that one simple gesture made it clear that whatever had happened during the conference hadn't been resolved, it had only been paused. As footage from the event began to spread across the internet, reactions came quickly and from all directions. Clips were shared, analyzed, debated. Some focused on Mayweather's intensity, interpreting it as dominance, as a sign that he had taken control of the psychological battle. Others focused on Pacquiao's composure, seeing it as strength, as evidence that he couldn't be shaken. Different perspectives, different interpretations, but all pointing to the same conclusion: something significant had happened. Something that had elevated the fight beyond expectations, beyond hype, into something more personal and more unpredictable. And that's what made that night unforgettable. Not just the words that were spoken, but the shift that they created. Because in boxing, the fight doesn't begin when the bell rings. It begins in moments like this, in tension, in silence, in the space between words where real emotions start to show. And on that night, for a brief but undeniable moment, the line between promotion and reality disappeared. What was left was something raw, something unresolved, and something that made it clear to everyone watching that when these two finally stepped into the ring, they wouldn't just be fighting for victory. They would be fighting for something much deeper than that.